Alignment versus nature versus demeanor versus persona versus shadow. What am I talking about? Let's get started. Hey everybody, my name's Joe. Welcome to Tabletop Theory, where we talk about how counseling theory and educational theory can be put together to help you learn how to become a better game master. Now, Dungeons & Dragons is something that right now is in its 5th edition and it's incredibly popular and everybody loves it, and chances are if you're watching this video, you have either started playing it, been playing it, or are thinking about playing it. And one of the things that comes up when you're creating something like a new character is the idea of alignment. So alignment is something that a lot of people love or they hate on. Some people think it's fake, some people think it's the most important part of a character, and some people define all of their actions, just or unjust, in their game based on what their character would actually be doing. I don't like alignment. At least, I don't like the way it's described in the 5th edition Player's Handbook, and in fact, I think that there is a better way to go about describing your character's personality, their desires, their wants, their features, and we can utilize the framework of alignment, but it needs to be adjusted a little bit. And in order to do that, we need to look at how 5th edition defines alignment, and then we need to go into a different system to try to figure out how that can be tweaked in order to better represent the psychology and the internal struggles and strife that define the characters that we want to play in our games. And that's a long way of saying I'm going to teach you how to do one thing with another thing, put those things together, and you're going to have a lot more fun playing your characters. Or at least I hope you will. Here we go. So the alignment section, which is quite brief, inside the 5th edition Player's Handbook reads the description of alignment as this. Alignment is a combination of two factors. One identifies morality, good, evil, or neutral, and the other describes attitudes towards society and order, lawful, chaotic, or neutral. Thus, 9 distinct alignments define the possible combinations. So what's that basically saying? That the Player's Handbook sort of crunches down a lot of different codes of morality and ethics and expression into 9 discernible types, going from lawful to chaotic and then neutral to good and evil and whatever. There's a whole bunch. I feel like if you're watching this video, you probably already have a good idea of what they are. But for those of you that may not, let's take a look at the chart. You have lawful good, and then you have neutral good, moving to chaotic good. And then if you take all 3 of those things and move them down one section, you've got lawful neutral, true neutral, and chaotic neutral. And then going down to the one section of the alignment chart that DMs fear to tread upon is the evil section, where you have lawful evil, neutral evil, and chaotic evil. Putting all those things together gives you the possibility to choose one of 9 different personality types, and generally speaking is the way that you as a player can sort of try to get into the head of your character. But I really think it's a bit flawed, and let me tell you why. You really have 2 parts to the alignment chart. You have the lawful, neutral, chaotic part, and then you have the good, neutral, and evil part. And, you know, the first part of it says the lawful, neutral, or chaotic kind of describes how your character would act, but then you have the good, neutral, and evil part, and that's the part that I think is actually a little bit dumb. And the reason for that is it's probably better described as an analogy. I don't really talk about politics on this channel, but I'm going to use it as an example briefly. When a lot of people on one side of the political spectrum, especially recently, have started to look at people on the other side of the political spectrum, I'm talking about right and left, they begin to demonize and dehumanize the people on the other side of the spectrum. And in some cases, they might even believe that the people on the other side of the political spectrum are evil. Is one side actually evil, or is it just a sense of perception? Is it just that we believe that people that don't hold the same values as us are evil? So if that's the case, and it's just a matter of perception, what does that do to the alignment chart? Is evil just a matter of perception, or in Dungeons & Dragons are we dealing with definitive concepts of good and evil? And I understand that there are arguments to be made on that case, because you have gods that are literally described as this is a good god, this is an evil god, and yes, when you're playing a fantasy game, there is a degree of willing suspension of disbelief that's required in order for you to sort of get into the universe. However, the thing that sort of started to come off the rails with that argument is the idea that as more people have started to play games like Dungeons & Dragons, people from different walks of life, areas of experience, cultures, are coming into this cosm that was created by white men in the 70s, and looking at all the different morality systems that they put into place and saying, I may not agree with that. So as alignment gets sort of examined and understood better and maybe extrapolated a little bit as more people begin to play it, the concept of what is good and evil gets broken down a little bit to the point where it doesn't really stand up to that kind of strong level of scrutiny. Because the idea is, at least in real life, nobody thinks they're evil. at least in most cases. However, people oftentimes on the other end of their actions don't believe that what that person is doing is good. They might believe that what that person is doing makes them evil. And that really comes down to the whole idea of understanding what morality is. And Dungeons & Dragons is, or at least it can be, utilized to analyze morality, but that's not really where I'm going here, because I want to kind of delve into it a little bit deeper. Or at least I want to delve into a creature. Specifically, from Dungeons & Dragons, the Troglodyte. Now, the Troglodyte is sort of that low-level NPC or evil character fodder that you throw at those low-level adventurers whenever they're entering their first dungeon. They're fairly easy to dispatch, and you can do it in high enough numbers that low-level characters generally feel pretty accomplished whenever they end up polishing off an entire cave full of Troglodytes. And Troglodytes are, or were rather, if you want to go really back into the whole Forgotten Realms area of lore of Dungeons & Dragons, created to serve an evil god, and then eventually I think they started serving another evil god. The Troglodyte represents an evil creature. Why? They put a lot of value on strength. They sort of operate on the same principle of self-interest that maybe a wild animal might. Because in a lot of cases, you have wild animals operating in a similar fashion to something like a troglodyte. You have a group of troglodytes that value strength. That's probably not much different than something like a pack of lions or hyenas or some other kind of pack-based predatory animal. I'm not a zoologist, feel free to correct me in the comments. So if you look at hyenas and lions and troglodytes and try to see where the similarities might lie between the three of them, what makes the troglodytes evil? Beyond the fact that, in the lore, they worshipped an evil god. There's really not much. Is it a question of whether or not a certain level of intelligence must be met before something can be truly evil? Yeah, maybe. But you can sort of start to see some of the parts of character design, character description, especially when we're talking about evil characters, that sort of starts to fall off the wagon. Not because it's bad or anything like that, but just because we can do better. And in order to do better, we're going to go into a different role-playing system called Vampire the Masquerade, specifically the 3rd edition. So the 3rd edition of Vampire the Masquerade is one of my very favorite RPG systems, and it's probably the one that I've played the most. You can see it sitting like right over there. It's over my shoulder. I love that book. I've had it forever. But the interesting thing about Vampire the Masquerade, the 3rd edition specifically, and I keep stipulating the 3rd edition because they kind of did away with this mechanic in the 5th edition, is whenever you're creating a character, the concept of alignment is gone. Instead, it's substituted for something called nature and demeanor. With nature, you're dealing with an internalized nature. You're dealing with something that isn't necessarily secret, but it's something that the character believes about themselves. You're dealing with the internal struggles, the internal thought processes, the internal strife and just conflict that constantly come around when you're dealing with a character that's undead. And then the other aspect of that is the demeanor. The demeanor of your character is something that they present to the world. It's their public face, or perhaps what Carl Jung might describe as their persona, because Vampire is a very political game in the way that all of the different vampire clans have their own sets of goals and desires, and there's like the end of the world thing going on in there. But anyway, all of those different steps and pieces to playing a vampire require the player to actually have those two separate types of character. You have a public-facing side and a private side. And as you start to learn more about your character, you start to develop both of those sides in tandem. And the thing that I really love about that idea of nature versus demeanor, or nature and demeanor in Vampire, is that it requires the player to think a little bit more in depth about how their character is going to present themselves, but also how the player is going to think about the internal machinations and ideas and thought processes and emotions of the characters that they're creating and eventually playing. Choosing a nature and demeanor in Vampire the Masquerade requires the players to go through an extensive list of natures and demeanors. But the thing is, that whole list can be chosen as either a nature or demeanor. And that means that you can have players that have sort of these flip-flop personalities. You can have a player that chooses to be a bon vivant, somebody who's just carefree and aloof and a little bit nutty as their sort of demeanor, but their nature might be a martyr, somebody who feels like that they have to be responsible for all the people around them. And if you kind of pair up the idea of somebody who's aloof but feels responsible, what does that mean for your character? But then, like I said, you can choose those things and flip their situations. So if you have somebody who acts like a martyr, but truly deep inside they want to sort of be this aloof person, what does that mean for that character? And what does that mean for how that player is going to choose to play that character? And that's a whole deeper discussion on the wonderful parts of that system that I truly love. But the thing about that is the idea of this public-facing persona and this very private shadow self really starts to remind me of a guy. We've talked about Carl Rogers before, but this is a different Carl. This is Carl Jung. So Carl Jung was a Swiss psychologist who was a contemporary-ish of Sigmund Freud, and really added a lot of different ideas and created a lot of the fundamental principles, which in some cases are still used, but more importantly were built upon to create a lot of the current techniques and philosophies that are utilized inside of modern mental health. Now, the idea of a persona and a shadow self, as brought forward by Carl Jung, is one that I really do want to examine, because in Vampire the Masquerade, the idea of a persona and a shadow are pretty much directly translated in terms of nature and demeanor. Now, when Carl Jung talks about the idea of persona, he talks about the idea of a public face, or the face that we might wear whenever we are out in public and trying to assume the role of perhaps our vocation or the part of our relationship. If you're a doctor, you have an expectation of yourself because the other people around you have an expectation of you. You're expected to have a certain level of professional decorum, perhaps adhere to a certain strict code of ethics. Jung hypothesized that if a person became too dependent or too focused on the persona part of their psyche, they might start to exhibit too much of a role, or rather they might try to lose themselves or accidentally lose themselves in the role of that persona to the point where they become disingenuous or fake, or they basically play so much of a role that they've created in order to fit into society, they lose their own sense of self. Jung might have referred to this as having a brittle personality, because if a person is so focused on the idea of this perfect role that if something were to come along and overwhelm that persona, that might cause something like a psychological break, and the person might suddenly become bereft of the role that they've been running for their entire life. If you're a doctor and suddenly you lose your job, what do you have? What persona are you trying to put on? The persona would be representative of an intellectual nature, not necessarily an emotional nature. The point of the persona is to sort of act as the suppressor for all of the antagonistic, materialistic, aggressive, sexualized, greedy, enthusiastic, sort of instinctual parts of the human psyche. Because all of those other parts, some people might argue the fun parts, are the responsibility of another part of the human psyche, according to Jung, and that would be the shadow self, or, if we're going in vampire terms, the nature. And the thing is, Jung was very specific. It's not that the shadow self and the desires that exist within the shadow self are bad, it's just that the person who has them believes them to be bad. Again, we're getting into the idea of subjective morality. If somebody who is on the alignment chart believes that what another person is doing is evil because they believe themselves to be good, they may see the values that that other person has and see that they are bad because they might see themselves as having similar feelings and desires and see them as bad in themselves. So when they see them exhibited openly by another person, that must mean that that person is evil. The shadow self represents the emotional nature of a person as opposed to the intellectual nature of something like a persona. And of course, I'm sort of paraphrasing and jumping around a little bit, but at the same time, follow me because we're going to get back to role-playing. Jung believed that a solid sense of self came from an amalgamation and acknowledgement of both sides of the personality, both persona and shadow self being acknowledged and understood and allowed to operate in a harmonious sort of way. Because as we all know, if we try to suppress everything about the desires that we have, what happens? We become overwhelmed. We become this fake version of ourselves that we don't necessarily enjoy being or trying to put on. It's stressful, it's anxiety inducing, it sucks. We want to make sure that we're trying to be our genuine self, and Jung believed that the combination of persona and shadow self would allow for that. But you don't necessarily want that. You're not after creating a balanced person, you're after creating a better role-playing character. So after all of that explanation, what does Carl Jung and Vampire the Masquerade have to do with anything about the Dungeons & Dragons alignment chart? Alignment, just like nature and demeanor, is a way that you express information about your character to the GM and the other players in your game. Sorry, DM, we're talking about Dungeons & Dragons today. So first, let's take a look, like I said before, about what alignment in Dungeons & Dragons actually is. It's a way for a player to know something about their character and how they might behave in certain situations. Okay, so that might be the persona of the character, right? The demeanor, or persona of your character, can be dictated by that first letter in the alignment chart, the lawful, neutral, or chaotic aspect of your character. We're not really going to worry about good, neutral, or evil right now, although we are talking about neutral because they use it twice. So what's lawful? A lawful character is somebody who follows the exact way that the laws are written. They want to make sure that they adhere to the social rules around them. The go-to example that I always like to use for lawful characters is Spock from Star Trek. No, not that one, the other one. Yeah, there you go. Moving into neutral, you have a character that might necessarily be lawful or chaotic, or rather agreeable or disagreeable to the social rules around them based on their own personal interpretation of the situation. One of my favorite examples for something like this would be House from the TV show House. Now, chaotic is an alignment part that I think is particularly misunderstood most of the time. A chaotic character doesn't necessarily just do what they believe to be right or do what they believe to be correct. They actively, in my opinion, repel and rebel against the different types of social institutions in the world around them. The best example that I can give of a chaotic character is from the movie Sid and Nancy. And if you're under 40, you probably don't know what that is. Just go watch it. Just don't watch it with your parents. Just because a character is chaotic, it doesn't necessarily make them more susceptible to the idea of evil. You can have chaotic characters who are in fact good characters. So let's go on to the idea of the other part of the alignment chart, the good, neutral, and evil part. Because, in my opinion, just like the lawful, neutral, chaotic was the persona, the good, neutral, evil is in fact the shadow or the secret part of a person. So the way I like to break down the good, neutral, evil parts of the alignment chart is actually pretty similar to anybody who might have picked up a Pathfinder rulebook in the past several years, because the way Pathfinder describes good, neutral, and evil is a varying degree of understanding what that character perceives to be their self-interest is. That's a long way of saying good characters are selfless and evil characters are self-interested. At least that's the way Pathfinder defines it, and that's the way I'm going to define it here. So a good character would be somebody who acts in a generally selfless manner. That could be the Doctor from Doctor Who. A neutral character would be somebody who could act as selfless and self-interested in different parts of their lives, or maybe even simultaneously. The example that gets used a lot for that would be someone like Deadpool. And of course, last but not least, is the evil morality, the idea that a character is more interested in their own self-aggrandizement, self-interest, and sort of achieving things for their own ends and not necessarily caring about others. The go-to for that would be Scar from The Lion King. That guy's all about those goose-stepping hyenas. So if you were to look at the same alignment chart from Dungeons & Dragons, and Pathfinder for that matter, and sort of understand it now as the idea of nature and demeanor, or persona and shadow, you might start to come around to the idea of how we can use alignment to better understand the characters that we're creating. It's not just about a character who wants to fight for good, it's a character who might look like they're fighting for good at all times, but might secretly have a self-interested motivation. Because a lawful good character and a lawful evil character might behave very similarly. However, all of their internal struggles are very, very different. Because remember what I said before, people don't often see themselves as the villain. This particular level of thinking about your alignment might be a bit over the top for people that just want to have fun, but I do know that there's quite a few people out there that want to try to better inhabit the persona of the characters that they're creating, or just try to understand them better. And I believe that trying to look at the alignment of a character as persona and shadow can actually give you an opportunity to really delve into the different psyche of your characters that you're creating, which, in my opinion, is oftentimes a lot more fun. If you really, really, really want to kick this up another level, I have an idea for you. Next time you're creating a character and starting a new campaign with a whole bunch of players, or as a player, suggest this idea. Don't reveal all of your alignment. Just reveal the idea that you are lawful, neutral, or chaotic. Keep the good, neutral, and evil part to yourself, unless you're talking to your GM. You gotta let them know. That way, all the other players know what you're doing is this character is lawful. So you know that you can expect that they're going to behave lawfully, and they're chaotic. You know and you can expect that they're behaving chaotically. But the good, neutral, and evil part of that is the internal nature of your character, and you can keep that hidden to give yourself an opportunity to really sort of change the way different characters interact with each other. It changes the concept of whether or not you expect a lawful evil character to act a certain way, or for that matter, a chaotic evil character to act a certain way. If somebody's just flaunting authority, but at the same time they're actually giving a whole bunch of money to charity, but they're doing it in secret, that would be the definition of somebody who is truly chaotic, but good at the same time. But if you don't know about that, or if it's happening secretly and you have different players actually sort of aligning themselves around these goals and learning about each other as the game progresses, in my opinion, that leads to so much more value around the idea of learning about characters through the act of role-playing. But remember, no matter what your character's alignment is, it's important to keep a couple things in mind about this. So back to what I started with. Alignment is just part of the larger game. And that's the important thing. It's a game. It doesn't matter if you use alignment in your games, it just matters if you think it's fun and if you think it's worth it. All of that to say, you can probably ignore all of this if you don't think alignment has any place in your games, but the thing that I really love about role-playing games is the opportunity to put yourself in somebody else's shoes and try to walk a mile in them. And the best part of that to me is try to learn about how that character might think. And if that's fun for you, then maybe try this out. It could be something that you're looking for. Dungeons & Dragons and other role-playing games allow us to play in the realm of imagination, and the big part about that is play. Play is meant to be fun. And if alignment for you is something that just sort of gets in the way, forget it, get rid of it, you don't need it. But if you think it's something that you might enjoy using in your game a little bit more with something like this technique, then I hope you do. So that's all I've got. Thank you so much for watching. I appreciate you being here. And I love the idea of injecting something like Carl Jung's ideas on personality into something like Dungeons & Dragons and role-playing games. If you enjoyed this, please let me know down here in the comments section. Or if you think I forgot anything, or you're a scholar on Carl Jung and I completely screwed this up, feel free to let me know how badly I did so down in the comments. You can follow me on Instagram or Twitter. If you want to encourage the growth of this channel, and I hope that you do, you can hit the subscribe button and come back to see more of these videos every 2 weeks, and you can even hit the like button, which lets YouTube know that you liked what we were talking about today. If you want to support the growth of this channel a little bit more directly with some financial means, I would really be grateful for that, and you can actually go over to my Buy Me a Coffee account, because let's be honest, I do subsist on a whole bunch of coffee and tacos. But I already have some supporters over there, and I would very much like to thank them tremendously for their donations that they've given already. And if you'd like to become one of them, then head on over there. I really want to try to keep these programs going, and it would help to cover some of the overhead costs of producing the videos. Most of you know what a coat of arms is. It's something that existed sort of in Europe around the Middle Ages to sort of be a representation of a royal or aristocratic house. I actually have one, and if I can find a photo of it, I'll put it right here. But the idea that I've seen a lot of other RPG groups using recently is creating a coat of arms for their own group. Creating a coat of arms can be a really wonderful group building activity for a group that might be looking for something to do that might be different than role-playing, or looking for something a little bit more artistically collaborative. The thing that I love about that idea is that it creates a myth for your group. And the thing about mythology is that we all love it. If we're playing role-playing games, we're engaging in the creation of personalized myths. And what's more fun than creating something that can last beyond the campaign? This gives the players and the GM an opportunity to collaborate on something that can be representative of a quest, a game style, a game system that they love, or maybe a goal that they might have for the future of their group. If you want to create one of those, I would love to see what they are. Think about it. If you make one, please share it with me. Have a great day, take care, be kind, and have fun adventuring.